This is a Gen 1 Audi R8 V10. Now if you're in the market for one of these, make sure you watch this video because I'm going to cover all the common problems, show you everything you need to know. Let's go. So it's actually really nice to be back filming with one of these R8s. One of the first buyer's guide I done here on YouTube was with the original V8. And here we are, all these years later, back with a V10, manual this one as well. Now the first thing I'd say to you, first bit of advice when it comes to these R8s, is the Gen 1s seem like amazing value. Seems like you get an awful lot of car for the money. But here is the little caveat on that. Buy a bad one of these and you could easily spend £15,000 putting things right. That's why it's so important to make sure you check everything we're about to cover. So I think let's start at the front, we'll work our way towards the back. So front area first of all. Let's talk about the bonnet, because one thing really common on these is oxidization. Tends to be right in this corner here. Now what happens is, if someone's removed these inside panels, or they've removed the bonnet and incorrectly stored it, it tends to just nick the paint right on this corner. That lets dampness and such seep in, and before you know it, you've got an oxidizing panel. So check that. Last thing in the world you want is to have your new R8 and need to get the whole bonnet resprayed. So on the underside of the front, what we've got is one of these, the front differential. So this is shared between the V8, the V10, and you'll also find this in the later Lamborghini Gallardos as well. Now, it tends to be relatively reliable in the car, left its own job, but the problem starts to occur when you put these cars on a dyno. They're not made to take that much torque. Dynos tend to overheat them and just burn them out. Now some electronically linked dynos tend to be okay, but generally it's just a bad idea. Keep the R8s and the later Gallardos away from dynos so you don't need to go replacing one of these. So next problem to talk about, right above that front differential, we've got the main coolant pipe. Now this is a dual pipe, runs from the radiators at the front of the car all the way to the engine at the back of the car. Now the problem is, it's got little brackets on it where it bolts onto the chassis. Now there's no inside weld on those brackets, so road silt, dirt, salt, all gets trapped in there, and over the course of the last 10 years or so, it starts to corrode away. Before you know it, you've got a coolant leak. So the way to spot that is have a look roughly in front, roughly in line with the two front wheels. Look for any little pools of coolant under there. Tends to leak onto the diff and then trickle down. So next up, let's address that big internet horror story, the frames cracking on these. Now what I'm going to say right away is this is not something you need to be overly concerned about. It's really quite rare to find on a car that's not had a front end bump. That being said, from 2011 onwards seems to be when Audi started fitting the little reinforcement plates. It's right where the strut tower meets the rest of the frame, tends to crack there if the car's had a front end impact. Now, if you want that peace of mind, those little plates can be retrofitted as well. But honestly, don't worry too much about it. So next up, let's talk about something that is a problem and is something that you want to be mindful of, and that is the magride shocks. If you've been looking at buying one of these cars for any time, you've undoubtedly heard of this, and unfortunately, it is pretty true. Not a great system. In fact, let me correct myself there. It is a great system when it's working correctly. Really responsive. You really feel it stiffen up the car. We'll get to that a little bit later when we take this out for a test drive. It is a great system, but notoriously unreliable. Now, it's a great example as well of just how the costs can start to add up on a car like this. Because if you buy a car needing 4 shock absorbers, you could be £6,000 there alone, getting them refurbed. That being said, you can switch to the passive shocks. You could go aftermarket, maybe get a set of coilovers, but you're going to lose that functionality of being able to stiffen it up. One thing you will find as well is that on the earlier V10s, these tended to be spec'd on almost every car. Unless that owner's since swapped it out, the one you're looking at probably has magride fitted. You can tell with a little button on the interior. But certainly facelift onwards, people started to realise that it could be problematic and switched it out for the passive shocks from Audi instead. So how do we go about spotting one of these knackered shocks then? Well, you're basically looking for any dampness on that shock absorber whatsoever. If you've got access to a ramp or you can jack the car or anything like that, that would let you see right away. Here's the important thing though, Audi will tend to tell you it's only a problem when it's leaking. as in putting pools of oil on the ground. If that's happening, that shock needs removing and replacing immediately. They tend to say that any kind of little seepage is normal. It's not. No shock absorber ever should be seeping oil. So if you see that, you know that shock absorber is going to need replaced pretty soon. Now the next point I want to raise, something that's just been done on this car, as I can see, are the brakes. This is another area that can add massive expense to your purchase. A set of front brakes and pads could be £2,000, so it's well worth checking that there's not a big lip on that disc. The pads aren't really worn, and if the face of the disc is looking quite poorly, remember the inner face is probably worse off again. It's not a complete showstopper. I wouldn't personally avoid a car with worn brakes, but I'd certainly be bringing it into the negotiation, saving a bit of money so I could get that put right. So next up, interior. Well, it's an Audi, innit? Everything tends to be pretty good quality, and the R8 Gen 1s are no exception. All pretty nice. The last two R8s I've owned personally though, that bit of trim fell off over there. I'll get it on the B-roll, don't worry. Now the thing to remember is when these R8s were new, the V8s, you had to specify the additional options, whereas the V10s were pretty spec'd up from the factory as it was. So usually, if you're viewing one of these, it's going to have most of the nice stuff anyway. Now, rather than go through absolutely every option, let me just give you the few that are a must for me. Bang & Olufsen stereo, absolutely top drawer. I would make sure the car that you're looking at has got that. Heated seats, I mean, nice to have if you want it. You can get monochromatic mirrors as well, where they dull if a light hits them, kind of like this one. Other than that, carbon, you could get loads of stuff in carbon. You could get the pull handle, you could get the door inserts, you could get this big J section, you could get the binnacle itself. Basically, just fill your boots on whatever you want to be carbon. Be warned though, if you buy one that doesn't have it with the intention of adding it later, all these little bits are really quite pricey. So gearboxes then, manual, obviously, as this car is, my personal choice when it comes to an R8, I think. Tough as old boots as well, really reliable gearbox, probably not going to have any issues there. One thing you do want to watch out for is that clutch being overly worn, so make sure that bite isn't too high in the pedal, and we'll talk a bit more about that once we get out on the road. Now the alternative to these manuals was what they termed the R-tronic. That was the same gearbox, same system as they put in the Gallardos as well, they called it E-gear there. Same system as I say. That is a robotised, automated manual gearbox essentially. They're okay. I mean, if you're used to a newer dual clutch setup, the newer equivalent, you're probably going to find it a little bit old hat, but it does get the job done. The nice thing about those R-tronics from a purchasing point of view is you can get a report done on the clutch wear, so you'll know exactly how worn that clutch is. Take it to any specialist that knows these cars and they should be able to do that for you. Post facelift, you're not going to get an R-tronic, you would get an S-tronic. Modern, dual clutch, big step on from the R-tronic that is. So working our way to the rear here, couple of things to be aware of, namely oil leaks. Now this was something I spoke about quite extensively in the V8 video, and that is that the oil sump plugs can tend to leak. The problem there is they've only to be tightened to a very small torque value. So over the years, service after service, they get over tightened and over tightened until the thread starts to come loose, and basically you can't seal it up tight enough for it to not drip oil. So sump plugs are quite a common spot to get leakage from. That sump either needs to be retapped professionally or a new sump just needs to be fitted altogether. Now the other thing on these V10s, they've got an oil pump shaft that runs just up the centre of the engine there. Now that's just like the old V10 RS6s as well, and just like the V10 RS6s, the seals can perish and start to leak. So overall, just have a look for any oil leaking around about the middle of the car. Now something else you've probably heard about is the oil lines leaking as well. Unfortunately that is true. Audi made them from mild steel. They did have a coating on them, but as the years pass, these pipes all chafe together, the protection gets taken off it. Before you know it, you've got a bit of corrosion on there, the pipe goes porous, and you've got an oil leak. These run slightly further out than the centre of the car. So overall, again, just have a look for any oil leaks underneath the car, and remember to do it once you've been that test drive and before you've been the test drive. Unscrupulous sellers will tend to mop up mess before you arrive. Final couple things to mention before we get this out for a rip. But first, a favour to ask from you guys. If you're getting value from this, please do go ahead and hit the like button on this video. Also, we create these buyer's guides for literally every type of car. So if you tend to buy second hand, it might be a worthwhile subscribe as well. Anyway, back to the checks. Roof. Basically, you just want to make sure that this all seems to be in good condition, obviously if it's convertible. And also make sure, even a couple of times, that the window goes down, the roof folds away, comes back up. Make sure there's no problems there. Not much else to check. Final point before we get this out on the road, and it's a proper pain in the backside problem. These fog lights, almost every R8 I've seen, the fog light doesn't work. It's just in a really bad position for catching all that moisture off the road. The moisture gets into the bulb holder. Before you know it, it shorts out, doesn't work anymore. Not a massive problem, but a great point to bring up in that negotiation. Keep yourself a bit of money back so you can get it put right. Dream moment, you're driving your Gen 1 manual, hopefully R8. What's it like? Oh, these cars are so nice to drive. The 3 pedals, the screaming V10. What more do you want? I think it makes it even more special that these things are a dying breed as well. It'd be too easy to slip into like a review mode here. Maybe if you leave a nice comment, the owner will bring it back and let us do another one at some point. The other thing I always loved as well is how quick an R8 revs.
Oh yeah.
Revs and de-revs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It just sounds badass when the revs come down fast. So the GTR, because of turbos and stuff, it's kind of, you rev it, it goes, yeah. But this is like a motorbike almost.
Yeah.
So what are the other points we want to check on that test drive? Well, first up, check that aircon. It's going to be kind of hard to feel it if you're in a Spider like us, but you want to make sure that's blowing cold. There's an air conditioning switch basically right below me in the transmission tunnel where the prop sits. That tends to go bad, and for the part alone, you're about £500. Now the last couple things I want to mention, again, make sure that clutch isn't slipping, get it into a higher gear, put the foot down, make sure the revs rise proportionally to the speed of the car. In other words, it's not revving like crazy and the car's not going anywhere. And final thing, brakes. Now I know I spoke about these being worn and how to check that back at the garage. The one thing we can't check when you're stationary is if the brakes are warped. So on the move, make sure you brake firmly a couple of times ideally, and make sure it's not wobbling like crazy through the steering wheel, because that's almost certainly warped discs. On a car like this, you don't want to really go skimming them. It'll probably come back, so you're going to need to spend that couple thousand putting it right. And there you go, you have all the tips you need to go off and find yourself a brilliant Gen 1 R8. Don't click off of this video just yet though, hang around and see how it scores on our reliability leaderboard. Oh damn! So, how do we score the Gen 1 V10 on a reliability leaderboard? Well, here's the thing, it's just like I said at the beginning of this video, buy a bad one and you're going to be spending a fortune putting it right. I think spend that bit more when you're finding a car rather than buying the cheapest example out there, because it's not going to be the cheapest for long by the time you start fixing it. Get an example like this one we've got here with everything corrected and all in good condition. So, how do we score it? Well, with all things taken into consideration, we give it a very respectable 8 out of 10. Now, thank you so much for watching. Please do hit that subscribe button and we'll see you next time.